So we have like a fantastic group of filmmakers, cinematographers, editors today who have approached the interview from so many different angles. So I would say let's just dive in. Christy Jacobson will share all of her delights and insights to the interview process, and then I believe you're showing a clip as well. So yeah, just take it away.
Cool. Hi, everyone. This is pretty humbling and awesome. Nice to see you all on a Sunday morning. So as Sandy said, I'm Christy Jacobson. I'm a filmmaker, and I've made a number of documentaries, all of which include interviews, and the interview process is one of my favorite parts of filmmaking. So I'm really happy to be here. Some of the films that I've made, for those of you who don't know, include a 2006 film called Toots, which was a historical documentary about my grandfather who owned a saloon in New York in the 1940s and 50s, so very much interview-driven. I made a film called A Place at the Table that sort of combined verite and interviews, and most recently I made a film called Solitary, which took place inside of a Supermax prison, and the interviews in that film affected me profoundly, and you're going to see a clip from that. Should I show the clip and then talk?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So you're going to see a clip from Solitary. So we'll roll that, and then I'm going to give you a few of my lessons learned in this life of filming interviews. Sorry, my heart is like racing because I haven't seen my own film in a while, and I'm taken back to that place. I wanted to share a couple of a little bit about the process of how, at least for me, I seek to get the best interviews that will serve the story or film that I'm making. I'd say that there's like before the interview and then during the interview, and then there's obviously editing the interview, which you saw, I think, extraordinarily done in that clip, but that's for another panel. I think one thing that's really important to do as a director who is not my own cinematographer is to spend time, first of all, thinking about what your story is and what style and approach you're going to take with your interviews, and to spend a lot of time with your DP talking about that and sharing ideas. So I often grab screen grabs from films, clips from films, photographs, so that we can make sure that we're speaking the same language before we're in the field making the kinds of decisions you need to make, which in some cases are on the spot in terms of lighting and composition. So you want to make sure that you agree with what you think is both creatively and visually and artistically superior, and that you don't have completely divergent opinions about that, so that you can trust each other when you're in the field. And then secondly, a second and most important thing before those interviews is to prepare. And that prep can range, but it's essential. And so it can range from, thinking through what is the story that you're trying to tell, if it's historical, if there's moments in the timeline that you need to hit, if there's certain perspectives you need to hit, certain very clearly defined subjects you need to hit, certain parts of one's experience you need to hit. So you need to think about all those things and imagine how the interview will unfold. So some interviews, let's say you're interviewing a politician, you have only 30 minutes, you've got these, really specific questions you need to ask. Sometimes you have an open-ended interview. But I spend a lot of time imagining how it will unfold. Like, if I met someone, how would I want that interaction to unfold? Even if it's someone I know, I've been filming with for a while. And like editing, for me, there's a lot of cutting and pasting and trying this first, then that, and well, if I ask that, then this. But all of this happens before the interview, so that when I get to the interview, now I'm switching to the during phase, that's all just a part of my brain. I never, and I suggest not doing this, at least this is the way I approach my interviews, have an actual list that I'm going through. Because I think the most important thing to do when you're conducting or experiencing, that's how I look at it, the interview, is to be present and to listen. And you might have some kind of ideas in your head about the kinds of questions that you thought you might want to ask. Those might go out the window. You might end up asking those in sequence. But anyway, the point being that you spend a lot of time thinking about it, and so that when you're there, you can just be present and you need to listen. And then that brings me to the final point about listening, which is that for all of us, we all experience like conversations all the time in our lives. And interviews, when I'm filming them, I generally establish that this is conversational, this is like a conversation. But it's not. And so expressive listening is really important. So I'm like an expressive talker, but when I'm listening, it's like some crew that I've worked with have said that they want to set up a separate cam just for my face, which I would never let anyone see because the like surprise and you know, like I just am an expressive listener, and so that is exaggerated during that process because I'm not speaking, but I am connecting. And so it's really important to be connecting and listening. And also when you're in conversations with people, and I don't know if you all have had this experience, but you know, you do your best to like avoid awkward silences because those are awkward. But when you're filming an interview, silence is like oftentimes the best question. It's not a question, it's just silence. And so often people will tend to fill that silence and move into something else that was on their mind that they want to talk about. So those are just some kind of things that I thought about on the subway here. That I wanted to share. But I mean, I just love interviews, and I love like I said, for me, I'm never conducting an interview. I'm experiencing this like often deep connection, even sometimes with someone who's like, I'm not going deep. I'm like, I'm there, and let's see where this takes us. And we can talk more specifically about that clip another time because I'm going to let the other extraordinary filmmakers speak.
Actually, you know what? I want to go right into that clip, and then we'll move around just because you had such a reaction in seeing it again.
Okay.
And if you could, you know, take us back to that interview where you stepped in, you know, into that interview. What was the experience of that? How did you feel about it? What does it mean now, looking back on it, for you?
I mean, I think that one thing I was struck by when I was watching it is obviously, or at least to me, the rawness of Michael. His name is Michael, who you saw there. And that particular film, so because I was filming inside of a prison with people who were being held in solitary confinement, i.e. alone 23 hours a day, the opportunity to talk to someone was an extraordinary gift and unusual for those men who had been living inside of their heads for, in some cases, decades, in Michael's case, probably a year. And so really all I needed to do was be present and say one or two questions. And again, I had some ideas about things I wanted to ask, but the rage that Michael began to talk about was perhaps like a list on my, prep questions or whatever to talk about how it makes you feel. But he just so went there that I felt, like I need to encourage him to keep going. He needs to do this. I need to be present to let this happen. And then the challenge was, how do I condense that and share it with an audience? And my editor, Ben Gold, who's an editor of a film here, Far From the Tree, by the way, you guys should see it. I think I was also just struck by his talent in watching that clip, because I was right back in that tiny room. And of course you all weren't, because you hadn't been there before, but I was. So yeah, I mean, I guess I just can't emphasize enough this don't be all in your head. That I think that a lot of people make that mistake, right? I'm so smart, and it's just who cares? Just be a person and be really present.
Beautiful.
That's me.
Thank you. Sam, who has just gotten off a plane early this morning from screening your film Sammy, and you've had so many roles of being a director, being an editor, and love to hear your wisdom on this.
I'm not sure it's going to be
interviewing.
wisdom. The first thing I would say is that, editing for such a long time, when you edit documentaries, you always look at the dailies directors bring in, and one of the things most seasoned editors do is complain about the interviews. They say, the director didn't ask the right questions. What kind of question was that? What kind of answer was that? Jesus, I could do 100 times better than that. It's terrible, terrible. So by the time I got the opportunity to produce and direct on Eyes on the Prize, I felt like I could do it better than any of these directors. But then I had a rude awakening, because I realized that to sit and do an interview, you have to be, as Chrissy said, you have to be prepared. You have to do your research. You have to understand who you're talking to. And the first time I went out to do an interview, I had been prepped by our senior producers, and I had my list of questions, and I went and sat in front of the person, and I had in my head the answers I wanted to hear. So I'm interviewing this lady from Detroit, and she's answering one of my questions, but it doesn't sound like how it was in my head. So I stopped, cameraman, and I turned, I said, Miss Jones, could you say it da-da-da-da-da-da-da? And Miss Jones looks at me and says, Mr. Pollard, please don't put words in my mouth. It was a valuable lesson that I learned from that point on. Don't try to put words in people's mouths. Let them speak from their heart and from their own soul. So, for me, it was sort of this real learning process, because I had been editing so long, I thought I knew how to do it, but I didn't. So the thing that I think Chrissy's absolutely correct about, you have to listen. You have to be able to listen to people, and you want to try to keep eye contact. The hardest part sometimes is, particularly when I'm doing the historical documentaries, I do all my research, I read the people's books, I read the articles, and then I have my questions, and I used to have it on sheets of paper, but now I do 3x4 cards, and I just sort of put down a couple of notes so I can keep looking at the people, because the worst thing in the world for me doing an interview is to sort of try to catch up with what you're going to ask, and you got to have a pause. It's like deadly silence. Deadly silence. So I'm always thinking. The other thing that's interesting that Christy said too is that one of the wonderful things about interviewing people is that you always have your ideas and questions of what you want to hear, but as you're listening to their answers, always the thing that happens is you hear other things. And your brain has to be very quick to say, oh, that's going to be a good question. And you have to ask that question. You have to be really thinking on your toes. The other thing that I think is invaluable for me is I always have a good line producer or associate producer standing behind me, sitting behind me. So after I finish an interview, I'll say, Daphne out here, Daphne McWheen. I say, Daphne, do you think I got all those answers? And she'll say, well, maybe you should. And I'll think, oh, okay. And I'll go back. Because I'm always trying to, you're right. You want to tell people it's a conversation, but in reality, it's not a conversation. You want information from them. So you're trying to get that information out, but you're trying to make them human. And we all have tricks. Usually I have a trick where as soon as before we start the interview, I'll always say, thank you, Christy, for sitting down today. I really appreciate it. It's always that trick, And if I think you feel uncomfortable, I will stand up and go lean over you and bend down because I'm so tall to make you feel comfortable. One of the challenging things about doing an interview, though, is sometimes I used to do pre-interviews. I used to call subjects beforehand and talk to them over the phone. I was doing a documentary about the Tulsa race riots, and I interviewed this gentleman who had been a little boy during the race riots. And as he told me some of the story over the phone, he was so emotional and so passionate. And this was another lesson I learned. Don't ask the questions you're going to ask in the interview when you do a pre-interview. Ask other things. Because as soon as I got this gentleman to the interview, the guy just froze up, man, like a stone. He couldn't answer one question. And I kept asking and asking and asking, and he couldn't do it. And I was like, oh, I failed this time. And the other thing that's always interesting about the interview is sometimes you get subjects, particularly the celebrity types, who don't give you enough time. I was in Arizona years ago interviewing B.B. King for a documentary about blues, and he only gave us 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I had 7 questions. I asked B.B. the 4th question, and I really wanted him to answer it again. I said, Mr. King, could you? And he said, Mr. Pollard, fix it in the editing room. He said, fix it in the editing room. And he wasn't going to do it again. you have a clip, right? But before I show the clip, I'm going to tell one story that I think is, to me, probably one of the best interviews I ever did. It was when I was doing Eyes, and I was doing a piece about Attica uprising. And I interviewed a gentleman named Big Black Frank Smith, who had been one of the prisoners who had helped take over the prison. And when the prison was retaken by, the federal state troopers, he was stripped naked. He was thrown on a board. They put hot shells over him. They tortured this man. They beat him. They made him run through a gauntlet. They beat the shit out of him. So I'm sitting there with Big Black, and we're asking him to sort of go back and relive that experience. And Black gives us the answer. He gives us the answer, and we cut, and we're shooting film then. I turned to my AP, Judy Richardson. I said, do you think we got it? And she said, I don't know. It didn't feel like it. So I turned to Black, and I didn't feel like we got it from Black. I said, Black, it was fine. The interview was fine, but, and this is really, you realize when you're making these films, you're manipulating people. I said, Black, you gave us the answer that we wanted, but I'm not sure you really went deep enough. Really, really went back and relived that experience. And I want to try to do a second take. And if you can do it, I think the audience will really understand what you went through. But if you can't do it, I said, I won't shoot anymore. So we had like a big 5-minute pause. Black thought about it. We all were just listening, sitting there. And Black said, I think I can do it. We rolled the cameras, and Black did that interview again. And by the end of that interview, Bobby Shepard, my cameraman, was crying. Judy Richardson was crying. And I was crying. And Black was crying. And that's probably the best interview I ever did. Really the best interview I ever did.
Beautiful. Thank you. Did you want to roll the clip? Yeah, thanks.
This is interesting. This film's going to premiere on Thursday night in Dock NYC at the IFC Center, so it's 7:30, and a 10 o'clock screening. But what's interesting about this from the interview perspective is that in doing this documentary, there were 3 different types of interviews I had to do. I had to do one where people knew him as a politician, so I had to be really up on his politics and what he meant to the city of Atlanta. And I had to know who these people were, these lawyers, these people who had been a part of his political evolution. Then I had to deal with the personal stories of his life, interviewing both his former wife, his widow, his children, understanding the relationship they had with him from a personal level, And then it was the people who were like the huge celebrity types like Bill Clinton, Jesse Jackson, and Reverend Sharpton, who gave me a little more sort of overview, larger context perspective on Maynard. So I had to always be thinking about who is this person I'm interviewing? What can they bring to the story? What are the elements I'm going to need to make sure I tell this story properly, And every time before I sat down to do an interview, I would put together my questions. I would talk to my producers, Wendy and Maynard III. I would talk to Daphne, and we would talk about, okay, what questions do you need to ask for this particular interview? What are you trying to get out of this person? One of the interviews that's really interesting for me in this film is that we interviewed one of the mothers of one of the victims of the Atlanta child murders, which I thought was very important because she gave us a different perspective on Maynard. It wasn't all he was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. She had issues with him. And initially, before she sat down, her reaction was, well, why are you interviewing me? You're never going to use anything I say in this film. And I said, that's not true, And she sat down, and she was so human, and she still lives that pain of losing her daughter. And she's very powerful in the film. So you always as an interviewer, as a director, you're thinking about who am I talking to and what am I trying to get out of that person? And you're trying to, listen, we manipulate, but you try to do it in a way that's gentle, unless you got somebody you don't like, And I usually don't try to do that to people I don't like, but sometimes there's exceptions. Thank you.
Did he look at me?
I mean, I had taken this quote from Errol Morris where you just reminded me of it. He says an interview really should be a surprise, an excursion into unexpected terrain. After he interviewed Robert McNamara in Fog of War, he said, I can't interview someone if I don't like them. Skepticism's key, of course. I think skeptics skepticism's truly such a wonderful thing, but respect has to be there. I'm not a Catholic priest. I don't want to hear his confession. I'm far more interested in hearing his story than in passing judgment. Nothing is so obvious that it's obvious. Some wisdom from Errol. So, Martina, so you also bring the perspective of a director, but also as a cinematographer, and that whole relationship of the director and editor around an interview, but also like what does it mean to lens an interview, to frame it, to think about. I mean, you've been on both sides of the camera now, so I'm so curious what you'd like to share about interview to launch off.
Well, the funny thing is that I worked with all three of you, with Sam by extension, but so and they were all extremely different interviews. Like Through a Lens Darkly was totally stylized and set up because it was about black photographers, so you had to respect them within the interview setup. And then we did this teenager together, where again, we tried as much as we can to prepare, but you don't know where you walk in all the time, so you have to be on your feet. But I absolutely second prep is key. Like talking to the director, knowing what she or he wants and how it will be conveyed and why you do what you do is really key to make it felt. Because we all, there's the Barbara Walters interview, which we all know, and then there's the interview that feels like it's happening in the moment, it's not prepared. And it's true, it's like you really make it feel like a conversation. Like I never felt that she was prepared, knowing that she is of course prepared, but it doesn't feel prepared. And we did like totally fly on the wall interviews where it was never the plan to do interviews, but what happened in the verite moment was so interesting that you just want that summary, right? But from a DP standpoint, yeah, it's all about prep, and it's all about what interviews. To me, it's always like they should feel like they happen on the fly. Even if you light it, if you set it up, if you're really like careful, and how it feels like, how it looks like. I personally prefer it to feel. It has to fit into the film. It can't feel like a standalone. And it has to feel like somewhat it's happening in the moment. And then, of course, there are trends. When you speak about lenses, there are trends. The current trend is like everything has to be autofocus, which I really enjoyed, if you can say enjoyed, the prison interview, because if you shoot in a prison, you have nothing, right? You have 4 walls and a table, and you have no choice because the prison decides where they're sitting. And this interview looked to me gorgeous because everything we needed to know was to see that corner that corners him, right? There is no exit. So you have to deal with what you walk into, and you can deal with it when you have the prep knowing what you want to convey. And then it's the same for the lenses. We all tend to go on a long lens, so the background is out of focus. But again, if you're in a prison, I'm sure a long lens was not possible. Because you can't get back, right? But then the wide-angle lens in this case also makes so much more sense because there is nothing beautiful about the situation. So why try to convey a beautiful interview setup? So again, to me, as a DP, no matter what I do, everything comes back to story. So you have to know what the story is, you have to know what the core of the story is, and then you figure out how you convey that with your technical specs, so to speak. And that's also when you have the prep and when you know what you want, it's very easy to react to the situation that you walk into. If you have no idea what you're doing, you really just catch up all the time.
What was it? Oh, yeah, Sam.
I have a question for Martine. So how do you feel today about, a lot of people are shooting with these 2 camera interviews. How do you feel about that?
Not a big fan. I mean, again, to me, first of all, I think every situation, interview or not interview, depends on the film and depends on the story. So, yes, there are moments for two camera interviews. I mean, it depends. It's helpful, but I also second that you always have to listen. So even as a DP, I have to listen to the interview and somehow, obviously you try to change size to give the editor something. So you have to listen to know when to change the size. I'm just in general not a two-camera person because it makes me lazy. Because I'm like, the other camera has it.
And what about 4K and just sort of shooting wide and then
dear.
just punching in? What do you think of that?
Yeah, also not a big fan. I mean, I'm a DP, so if somebody tells me like, it doesn't matter, like, we punch in later, I'm like, well, why am I here? So you wanna, I don't know, I like to think while I'm on set. And yes, 4K is great, you have the resolution. It's great if you have to fall back onto having to punch in. But I wouldn't make it the rule. I wouldn't start out like that. And just don't tell your DP.
Yeah, I think what's kind of interesting is that, these new techniques and rules, we know a lot of people shoot with, I've shot with the 2-camera setups, and sometimes now you got that front angle and you got that side angle. And sometimes I look at the side angle and say, oh man, this side angle shit is terrible. Why I keep doing this? And then I won't do it for a while. The thing that's always interesting about when you used to shoot with one camera and your camera person, was forced to listen, they would sometimes do things in terms of making a move, an adjustment, when they heard something from the interview that was really emotional. And I used to love to see that. All of a sudden you see the cameras kind of slowly move in because the camera person's really listened and said, and you catch that beautiful moment, that beautiful texture, which we're sort of losing now because we're shooting the 2-camera thing. And the other thing too with that 4K, I just been shooting lately on the dock. And the executive producer basically, we're going to shoot 4K, we're going to punch in, So the old days where I would always say to the cameraman, listen, if you have to change the frame on my next question, I didn't do it this time because I knew we were going to punch in, punch in, which I agree with you. It's in a way you're kind of losing sort of the craft of it, the specialness.
And I would add one thing to that, I think a similar perspective. But I feel like the moments when I'm with the DP, and I was just shooting, I think it was on Friday, and we were shooting an interview with this young man who was participating in this program, and we were in this computer room, and we spent a lot of time, setting up the shot, and then setting up the frames, and so there's a tighter frame and there's a medium frame, or whatever it is, and so you're connecting with your DP in those moments, just on I don't know, in life and on the story and what's important and what matters. And I feel like, again, and I shot recently with 2 cameras because that was the specs of the series I was working on, and I was like, I set it up so that I had the cameras were as close together as possible, and just one was wider and one was, because I couldn't deal with that letting go of the control or the participation of my DP. And to your point about making sure you always have a really smart, thoughtful associate producer or producer there to basically cover your back. Also, I've found, one of the most important, there's 3 final questions I always have. So first of all, I say this is my final question, and it never is, but that always happens. But then I say, is there anything I haven't asked you that you thought I would ask you? Or anything you want to talk about based on what we just talked about? And that can be anything, and to the subject. And that often, not always, so it's if 9 times out of 10 something doesn't work, but 1 times out of 10 it does, I do it all the time. So that question can sometimes be really valuable. And also I ask if anyone, my DP, my sound recordist, anyone has another question to ask that I didn't ask. And so my DP and my sound recordist didn't do the prep that I did. They prepped in a different way to make sure they were going to be recording really good sound or shooting with the right lenses and staying in focus and rolling and other things. But so they sometimes ask a question that is the best question. And so if you're trying to put yourself in the position to succeed, and by succeeding you're getting a really great interview to tell your story, those are some, what are they called? Pro tips. That you're maybe not the smartest person in the room, so let the ones that are also ask a question.
And I also ask my DP and my sound person too, if they have any thoughts, because we've also been shooting with someone for a long time. They have their relationships to the subject and their own relationship to the material and the story. So they're a source of a lot of wisdom.
And they can ask stuff that maybe you can't ask.
Right. I mean, to me, it's almost like as a DP, because I don't have that insight that a director has, I'm sort of the first audience, right? So when the interviewee says something, you react as the audience would react. When you're like, wait, but I don't understand that. So that can be helpful. And I also, from a DP perspective, people always repeat themselves. It's just human nature. So you really have to listen. And when you hear the second time around, you can change frame. And then they have the two sizes, which they can intercut. Because everybody repeats themselves, almost everybody. Wait, I had a whole mental list. All right, go.
What I also do at times is sometimes I'll know when I'm interviewing a person, a person I'm interviewing, that usually when I ask the first question, I know that the answer won't be strong because they're sort of not relaxed, they're not in the moment, they're kind of a little apprehensive and uptight. And then as I get near the end of the interview, I go back and ask that question again in a different way. By that time, most times they're relaxed, they give you a different answer, and I'll usually have a different frame, so if it works, I can intercut them. I do that a lot.
But I also wanted to come back to 4K, because I did, for example, for Anoni, formerly Anthony and the Johnsons, I did the backdrop.
For what?
Anoni, formerly Anthony and the Johnsons.
The singer, yeah.
Yes. So I did the backdrop for her world tour, and it was humongous. I forgot the size. And she would do the world tour, so she never knew what projector she had. So we were like, let's shoot 4K or 6K or 8K at the time, whatever it was. And then I watched it in the Armory, and it was too sharp, because that's the problem with 4K. You're shooting an interview, you're trying to be really emotional, and like every pore jumps into your face. It's just too sharp. To me, there's no reason why I would use 4K, really. I know there are specs you have to follow, but so that.
That's super interesting. Do you want to share something about shooting the final year? And I believe you brought a clip from that film.
Yeah, shall we watch the clip first? Yeah, I guess we're not laughing anymore, huh? So that was obviously a situation where I had no control. These people were busy running a country. And also going back to the two camera setup, I find, because you would think like, well, you shoot Obama, so I'm gonna have two cameras and I have like a gaffer and like 10 lights and all that. None of that. Just going back quickly, like the two camera setup is also very impersonal, because they're sitting down and you have to light for two angles, right? So there's a lot of machinery going on. So, sorry, afterthought. Back to Obama. Yeah, we had no control. I mean, they were working, and we were allowed to participate in snippets. And obviously with the detail, with the security, they gave you exact guidelines. So if there was an interview situation, the director really had to be on his toes very quickly, and it had to happen quickly, and there was always a time limit. We were told that for the last Obama interview, which you only saw a very short clip, we had 10 minutes, and he stayed for 14 and a half, and that was unheard of. It had never happened before. So, but that was in Greece. It was at the end of his administration. But you just have to be on your toes, and you want to make these people look good, since they are running the country and we are sort of depending on them. And you have to go with the flow. You just have to. You make it the best you can in the moment, and you have to be quick on your toes, especially when you shoot with people who are like 6'2", and I'm 5'4". Oh, we used the Sony A7, which is a very small camera, because it was all about being unobtrusive. They we didn't want to give them the feeling we're just from the press corps, because it took a really long time until they understood the difference between us and the press corps. So we were just like, it was just the three of us hanging out, the director and sound guy and I, and we were hanging out and waiting for the moment, and sometimes waiting was very long. But so I only had that tiny, tiny camera, which is really hard to operate. Don't make the mistake to think it's easy just because it's small.
And was it? I mean, I'm thinking of a very key moment in recent documentary where Robert Durst goes into the bathroom and he doesn't take off his mic, and the mic's going, and then he says, this is in Jarecki's The Jinx, the HBO series, and he mutters to himself, there it is, you're caught. What the hell did I do? Kill them all, of course. And then he was arrested and charged with murder. So I guess there were very clear lines for you about when you turn the camera on and when you turn the camera off with this scenario, or no?
We could never mic them. They would have never allowed. I mean, just the fact of having to be that physical was. I think we mic'd John Kerry for one interview. But again, it's like if you have 10 minutes, you don't want to spend 4 minutes micing somebody, right? So you have to be fast. And I mean, literally, they gave me guidelines. They're like, you can go up to here, and then I had to negotiate. Like, can I go up to here and then actually shoot like this, to gain another angle? Because it's the president of the United States. What do you do?
Wonderful. When we were talking before, Christy, I put this out there to, what is Sam, you shared that beautiful story of the best experience of an interview. Christy, you had a great story of the worst experience of an interview, and I'd love for you to share that with everyone.
Okay. It may be worst, and in the retrospect, since we spoke, also best in some ways. So I was fortunate to spend a lot of my early years as a young filmmaker working with Barbara Koppel, who's an extraordinarily talented filmmaker, and had this opportunity we were working on a short film that was, the purpose of the film was to show law students how valuable lawyers can be in sort of making the world a better place. So we were making a film about a guy who was on death row in Huntsville, Texas, for a crime that all accounts show he didn't commit. I didn't tell you this part, but his lawyer was sleeping during most of the trial, and it was written about. And on appeal, the Supreme Court of Texas ruled that while the Constitution provides that you have decent defense, it didn't require that the counsel be awake. So we had spent the day before we filmed with George with his family, with his wife and 2 sons. And then we filmed, we got in the prison, and we're filming this interview, and I was filming with a very experienced DP, a very experienced sound recordist. We set up for the interview, there was glass between us, and we began the interview, and George and I did what I suggested often happens when I do interviews, which is we connected, and I was moving through the story, and I asked him what he missed most. And he started to talk about his sons, who I had just filmed with, and he started to tear up. And I literally broke in and asked him if he liked cars. I cut him off, because it was this human instinct to help someone who's feeling sadness to not feel sad, to comfort them. That's not an instinct that's particularly helpful when you're filming an interview with someone and hoping to move people, and that person's signed on to go there, But I was inexperienced and young, and so we moved through the interview, and I avoided him getting emotional for the rest of the interview. And the interview ended, and it was Don Lenzer, Don, and Peter Miller, these guys who've been doing this a long time, and they were like, what the fuck? What were you thinking? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I did not even know. So we got back, and those were the days when you made your dailies onto VHS tapes, and I put the tape in, and I watched it, and I was like, I get it. And I watched it. What I did was I watched it over and over and over again to help myself understand what I needed to do as a filmmaker in that moment. Again, having agreed with this man that he was going to tell me his story for a lot of reasons, so that A, he could potentially get released, but also that others would benefit from him sharing his pain. And I then understood what my role is, which is to allow him to do that and give him the best possible forum to do that. And so it's an example of, you know, as you said, like we're manipulating, we're not actually having a conversation, we're trying to get something, and we're also being human, but there's some human traits or normal social cues that are, you know, I've never made that particular mistake again. I make mistakes all the time. But so in some ways that was a great interview because, I mean, we did end up getting really good material and we told a good story, but it was a really good kind of lesson for me. And also, by the way, I told Barbara, I was like, look what I did, you know? And so we talked about it and, you know, I tried to use it as a learning experience. But I say that just to be encouraging of your remembering what your role is in that moment. And I always, now I'm rarely also like you in the case of like trying to get someone. So I often, in fact, almost always say, if I ask you something you didn't want to be asked, if you want me to stop the camera, I will. And so it's an attempt to somehow create an equality that we know is not exactly true, but it's a shared respect. To your point, your Errol Morris quote, that I respect you and hopefully you respect me. And if you need me to stop, I'm going to stop because we're in this together. In most of the situations in which I'm doing interviews, not all.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
I'm wondering if you have any advice on situations where there's like information that needs to be conveyed that you know, it's like they've told you a million times, but you just need them to say this thing rather than like asking them to just say it, which would obviously be damaging for a bunch of reasons. Is there a way that you go about handling those situations?
So I'll repeat the question. So this is where you both know that there's information that needs to be conveyed in the film, and how do you draw that out of the interviewee in a way that really serves? Is that your question? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think it's, you know, as Sam was talking about earlier, your prep, right? So you need to know a lot about that person, more than just what that information is. So you need to like maybe move through a bunch of other things, and I don't call those things like garbage or throwaway, just like move through a lot of things. And then also in the prep, I mean, I think about, and with my team, and in particular, if I have an editor on board at that time, like all kinds of different ways to ask a question that might elicit that answer. So there's not one question to get that answer, but there might be many different ways that you have to keep going at it. So having a lot of different questions that might get you there, and maybe some like unexpected ones. Seems like Sam has maybe some better ideas.
Yeah, what I do, I'll give you a great example. I'm working on a documentary now about voter suppression and voter fraud, and we had interviewed the lady who runs the Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill, and as we're getting closer to the cut, we felt there was some information that we needed from someone like Sherilyn that wasn't in our first interview. So we asked her to do a second interview. We asked her to try to dress in the same clothes. We went back and we shot her again. And we had specific questions where we knew we wanted to get certain answers. Now, I didn't say to her, like I did to that woman in Detroit, please say it like this. I would ask the question, and then Sherilyn would give me the answer. And then, if I didn't feel it was quite on the nose, I would ask it again. And she would even say, do you want me to say it like this or say it like that? She would help me a little. So I did it that way with her. Sometimes when you're interviewing people, like Chrissy just said, you're not hearing your answer because you got certain information you want. But in the case when I'm doing these historical docs, when I did Slavery by Another Name, I knew that these people had so much information that I could ask that question in 2 or 3 different ways and get the answer I wanted, you know, and really get the answer I wanted. And sometimes what I'll do, I'll go back and look at the dailies, And if the subject didn't give me the answers that I wanted, then I know that, oh, I got to interview someone else who's going to get me closer to that. You know, sometimes you have to understand as a director, you're going to have to sometimes shape those answers in the editing. You know, you know, and listen, we all know how to edit these things together so you can get that answer that you want. You know, you have to shape it a little bit. When when I was editing the Sinatra documentary for Gibney, we did a long interview. Who's the guy on the radio show? Jonathan Schwartz. Thanks, Marty. Jonathan Schwartz loves himself. He goes on and on and on. We did like a 3-hour interview with that guy. But as he's talking and talking and talking, I heard all these jewels. And I knew that he was giving us the stuff that was going to work. And I knew that it was going to be, you know, a real sludge in the editing room, but I got it. Right. Go ahead, Jonathan, talk and talk. I love myself. Oh, but I do love Frank Sinatra, and this is why. So you get the answers. You just have to be patient. Patient.
Yeah. And I would just add one more thing to that, is that if it wasn't something super emotional, like Sam was saying that you hopefully didn't already ask them, but it sounds like you're saying you already know they have this information. Sometimes I say, well, we were talking earlier about X. Can you talk to me about that? It sounds so basic. And so can you talk to me about X? How did that make you feel? Why? These are some really valuable questions that, when asked at the right moment, can elicit quite a range of responses, and hopefully the ones you need.
I mean, I was just with my editor. We're watching footage I've shot for 13 years on this film, Rabbi, and my editor has red, blue, and yellow dots on the footage. And red is like informational, and yellow is like, there's emotion, like this is a great select, but blue is like, whew, and you want to go for the blues. So, I mean, his theory, his name's Philip Shane, he cut and co-directed Being Elmo. He really says, go into the presence, take the character into the present tense, and make it as emotional, make it evocative, make it sensorial. You know, have the subject guide step by step the memory of something. So it's not just information, but it becomes a story. What did it smell like? What was it like when you opened the door? What did you feel before that door opened? So really sort of bringing the character, I mean, as you did, Sam, with Big Black, who you took him back into that moment. And I think that's what's so powerful.
I'm going to say one thing.
Yeah. Oh, so go ahead, Sam, and then you next.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So you have like a proxy person interview them for you? Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the question is, you know, especially a politician or someone who's just formal or nervous or is guarded, how do you disarm them? How do you make them feel comfortable? What are techniques that you use? And that could also be from the cinematography side, too, as a DP.
Well, I mean, I just know that Greg Barker, who directed the final year, he really was close. You know, he didn't keep the distance that you would think. He was respectful, but he tried to be as close as possible to make it a conversation. And that really also, again, I think that actually helped that we didn't have a setup. You know, we didn't have the sit down. They were all standing. I mean, John Kerry sometimes was sitting, but it was in his office. He didn't have to come to places. So it felt natural. And you talk to them as a person, not as what their function is. Right? You don't treat them like the President of the United States. You have the respect, but you want to know what Barack Obama has to say.
I often use humor. I self-deprecate. And if I've done my research, I might know something about that politician like that, even though they're the representative from California, they grew up in Ohio, and my husband is a Reds fan. You know, like I just, I'll just try and like go into something that helps them connect with me as a person. But if you don't have time, then I just get the goods, you know, like, and which is the information, right? On a human level. But if I've got some time, then I try and just be really real, or just talk about something in the moment that has nothing to do with why we're there, and it can like maybe just crack the armor a little bit, and then if you have more time, you can keep cracking at it.
I would say this, to answer your question about the long-distance interviews, I think those are terrible. I mean, I did one with Nancy Sinatra recently for my Sammy Davis Jr. film, and I just felt, it was too cold, it was too distant. I mean, I want to really be in the room with you. I want to look at your eye. I mean, I was in California yesterday, in Los Angeles, and before I went to my Sammy Davis screening, I went over to the composer's house who's doing the music for the voting suppression voter fraud film. And I sat in her studio for an hour and a half, and we were eye to eye talking about the cues. And it was so much better to me than when I talked to her last Thursday over the phone and we're giving her my notes about the cues, because we were connecting. She could go to the piano, she could try something. I said, yeah, that's right, Kath, I want that, I want this. I want to feel that. We were looking at the picture together, we were connecting. So when you do an interview over the phone, and I've done them, they never feel like I'm connecting. It's like, I'm not there. We're not together. So to me, if you're trying to do an interview that's really important, really, really important, try to be in the space with the person.
Yeah, I think. Oops. Go ahead. No, I just think it has to have a story point. If it doesn't have a story point, then everybody will want to know why. And of course, as a cinematographer, it just doesn't look that good to have the Skype camera record you. You take the humanity out of it.
Let's take some other questions. Right over there, and then you, and then three. Yeah.
How do you deal with people, particularly scientists or academics, who revert to their jargon, mostly because they're concerned about how their peers will respond rather than the general audience? Do you have ways in which you can break through so that they speak in a way that makes sense for responding?
So how do you respond? How do you interview scientists or academics who have their jargon and are a certain language?
I'm smiling because one of my favorite interviews was with a academic and expert who'd been writing about and teaching about hunger in America, the systemic forces that cause hunger since the late 1960s, and had been saying, like, a lot of the same things, of which we wanted to get for the interview, but we wanted it to be conversational. Was that you that asked the question right there? Okay, I just was not sure if I was looking at the right person, although I'm speaking to all of you. See, I need to connect. So I prepped like it was nobody's business. All the timeline of hunger in America, how it was solved in the late '60s, and all these things. But I did just spend a lot of time asking him questions which is why it's one of my favorite interviews. He said he'd never been asked before. And a lot of those had to do with how he feels. So he was like aghast often at my questions, not that they were offensive, but they were just like, do you remember this moment and that? How did you feel during that? And so I kept kind of at that. And also when there are breaks, as you can tell, I'm a pretty informal kind of person, and I wanted to impress him on some level, but I thought it was less important to impress him with my intelligence and grasp of all the specifics, and more important to be real. So anyway, asking people like that how they feel, or writing your questions, but then kind of trashing them and figuring out ways to talk to them in ways they hadn't been talked to before. Now he ended up by the way, crying in that interview, which I didn't stop him from doing. And afterwards was like, and he then retired from doing this and like moved to Africa. And he had been interviewed by like, every journalist about this subject. And he said to me, that was the best, most surprising interview I've done. So I think it's to like try to find, because what we're doing, likely most of in this room, is not a short news piece, but telling a nuanced story. And so to do that, we need for everyone to try and feel. And also, if they trust you and have respect for you, and you can show them your work or something, you can say, you need to understand, like, I'm only gonna use a small bit of this, you gotta just let go. Now, that doesn't account for someone who's just really nervous and might be a lost cause. I'm talking about the academic vibe that you're talking about.
And I think also people want to have a cathartic experience. I feel like people want to go on a soul journey together in an interview. Like, they want to be transformed. They want to relive their life. They want to sort of take a breath out of the everyday rush and just really sink in to their life. And you're giving them, and they're giving you, you're exchanging this enormous opportunity together. And I think it's a deep, I think interview, I think they're very holy, and they're gorgeous, and there's something about life in them that is very special.
But let's be realistic. I interviewed a guy in California in August about voting suppression and voter wars. He wrote a book called Voter Wars, right? Named Rick Hasson, a wonderful man. I interviewed him for an hour and a half. The guy was such a stiff. I tried everything. Right. This guy was as stiff as a board. We've ended up only using like one bite. I tried. He had all the information. He was very informed, but was he dry? And I tried everything I knew in my toolkit, but the guy was still dry. But the opposite. Everybody seen that show, the Circus Inside? What's that Showtime show?
The Circus.
Mark McKinnon. I interviewed him. He's not as informed as Rick Hasson, but the guy is so human. Right. And I interviewed him for an hour and a half, and there was like jewels popping out of his mouth. Jewels, just jewels. It's like, oh, thank God.
Yeah, so as a filmmaker, you got to know when to toss that aside and find someone else who can deliver what he didn't. Yeah.
Martina, and then I know there are two people who have questions that I pointed to before, so Martina will respond, and then if both of you will ask your questions in a row, because that will be the last round.
No, I just wanted to agree with you, because I'm shooting primarily verite. I mean, I think we all do, basically. And there's nothing more beautiful than watching things unfold, but when you ask a specific question and it's a real exchange, you get a depth that it's really hard to get in verite. So I think it's the communication between verite and interview, and even if you use the voiceover, just a voiceover from the interview, as an audience member, you can feel that connection when somebody sat there and actually answered from the depth of their heart. And I think you're right. When people sit down and give you an interview, unless they can't, they really want to connect. And it is an exchange. Don't look at it as, I have questions and I need something from you. You also have to give something.
So I believe you, and then you. So yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering what strategies you use when an interview is going off the rails and you do have limited time and you just need to steer it back in a respectful way that doesn't throw them off.
So strategies for dealing with an interview going off the rails, and how do you write it back on? Yes.
Just a couple quick pro tips if you have someone who's not that good at remembering, like answering a complete sentence, or don't look at the camera, or whatever, and you don't want to get them in their head. Like, you want to be respectful and keep it conversational, not miss.
So pro tips on not looking into the camera, taking the words of the question, some pro tips on that.
Yeah, but I do that all the time. I'll say, look at me, and I always start sometimes by saying, no one's going to hear my question. So try to interpret, put my question as a part of your answer. Now, some people, 9 times out of 10, we all know this, they never hear that. They never hear it, and you say, okay, and my brain basically says after a certain point, don't try to keep asking them to do that. You can figure it out in the editing room, The thing about people not looking at the camera, the thing to remember is that some people like to see themselves in that camera. The celebrity types sometimes will look at the camera, and you have to keep saying, don't look at the camera, look at me, look at me.
I mean, I think that also, I agree that like you can only, if you've said that once or maybe twice and it's not happening, yeah, then you're realizing like, do I have what I need? Am I gonna have to cut that off of someone else? And like, because you risk just not getting no material, right? Versus getting some material that isn't necessarily the full sentences that would be most helpful. But I mean, what isn't documentary edit if it's not dealing with what you got and making it work, right? So work on getting stuff that's valuable. We didn't talk about eyeline, but that sort of factors into that. And my eye lines are often very close to the camera. Yours the same way, and
Same.
Martina, yeah. So I'm always like right next to the camera, but like I literally do like I'm like a freak, you know, like. But the interview subject never thinks I was a weirdo. But again, if there was that second camera on me, so I'm like, you know, and it actually helps. I know that seems absurd, right? But like, you're just like getting them to look at you with strange expressiveness. And the going off the rails. I mean, sometimes I'm just like, I drop a pen. I like, you know, like I'm like, I cough. I just like give some reason to have a restart. We stop. I'm like, so sorry. Let's just start again. And what I wanted to ask you was this thing. So if you can just like literally like stop the train, that can sometimes help. And also you might say like, I totally love what you're talking about. I could talk to you about this for hours.
Christy,
But we can't.
can we just give Sam
Sa-
a round
Sam
of
is going to
applause?
his
Because he must
screening.
go to his
Yay,
screening.
Sam!
So
And Maynard is also the closing night of the festival, so I think it's sold out. But thank you so much, Sam Pollard.
thank you, Sam.
Second screening. Second screening is not sold out.
So
Thursday
Maynard,
night.
which you can see up there.
Yeah. And the final year. Do you want to tell us about the final year when we can see that? Aside from here.
It's right. I think we had both screenings already here.
The opening night.
It
And
was
so I
the
guess
opening
HBO.
But it will be on
HBO and Magnolia is going to be releasing it on January 19th. Spread the word.
You know so much more than I do.
And Christy,
Chris-
where
I'm a
can we
fangirl.
where can we see your films, Christy?
So Solitary, the film you saw a clip from, should be on HBO Go right now. And A Place at the Table might be on iTunes.
And what's your next film coming out?
Oh,
when?
and coming out soon will be a film about the Billion Oyster Project, which are a bunch of teenagers that are working to save New York's harbor and through that, the universe. And that's going to be called The Harbor Keepers. It's coming out
On
sometime
what?
soon.
And
On
it's
Discovery.
On
gorgeous.
Discovery.
Oh, and Martina and I worked together on that. Yeah.
Yeah,
My
I'm not the
enthusiasm
DP,
is
but
like
it's
over the
gorgeous.
top right now. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have another round of
Yeah.
applause for Martina
Thank you,
and
Christy and Martina.